Everybody, and welcome. Thank you for coming. So we're going to talk a bit about climate, and our climate is getting warmer. And some of us might think, especially in the west of Scotland, having a bit of warmer weather, that might be not such a bad thing. But we often then not quite think how others are affected with that. Others, a small change here might make actually a very big difference somewhere else. And somewhere else, there might be quite of a big impact. And it's sometimes quite difficult for these voices to be heard. So there might be low-lying islands we heard last couple of weeks will be affected by being flooded, and they struggle to make their voices heard. And it's not only other nations which are struggling to make their voices heard, it's also some of the animal life, especially animal life, which operates far outside from our reach, like seabirds, which are exploring the oceans and are out of our sights and out of our minds. And if they struggle, they die quietly at sea, and we're not really taking any attention of that, unless, of course, some of them are have very good innovative skills, and they are managing to find alternative ways of making a living, and they come at times a bit close to us for our comfort, and they become a nuisance. Isn't that a cry for help? Isn't that a reflection of that these animals can't make a living anymore in the environment in which they're supposed to live? So we know that our oceans are warming, and that is a very powerful illustration of that, which was displayed on the university campuses about 10 days ago by the artist John Gerard, and just reflecting that the oceans is absorbing about 90% of the heat that we are trapping through our activities, and therefore the oceans is warming up. But what are the effects of these warming oceans on animals living in there? And when Jean and Mike asked us if we have to contribute anything to their exhibit they are planning about reflecting climate change research in Glasgow, I sort of struggled first a little bit where to start with that very complex issue. We are working on a food chain from plankton to fish to top predators, and there's a lot of different steps in there. There's a lot of species which interact with each other, and we really have the aim to understand the impact of climate change on forager biomass and its impact on seabirds. And in particular, we're interested in the North Sea, and the very important forage fish in the North Sea is the sand eel. And so I had some sort of vague ideas of what we could possibly show along that food chain. And that's from a project which has lots and lots of collaborators, which you see listed here, of which Agnes Olin is a key contributor, a PhD student who brought all these things together. So I had some suggestions about possibilities, and to my amazement, Jean and Mike came back and said, well, we'll take all of it. And what fantastic display they managed to make. Really great. Thank you so much for giving us that opportunity and make these silent voices heard about the impact global warming has on them. So I want to get you through a little bit through that display they have put together. I'm starting at the bottom, so to speak, of the food chain. I'm starting with the plankton, which is tiny floating animals in the sea. Some of them are operating a little bit like a plant, and they catch sunlight and convert that into biomass. That's the phytoplankton, and then it's the zooplankton, which is feeding on that phytoplankton. And you see here in this display on the right-hand side, on the, what is it for you? On the right-hand side, you're seeing here a whole range of different planktons, which are made as origami, which is made by Neil Banas, and they're all made to scale. They're 50 times the size. You see there are some huge animals like the krill here, which give a very substantial meal to a predator, like a fish. And there are lots of much smaller species which are down here, In itself, they don't make much of a meal, but if they're very abundant, predators can make a living out of them. So how does the climate change affect these marine organisms? And the answer there is that they can affect them on a surprisingly large spatial scale. If we are thinking about the North Sea, certainly the water's warming up, as we just heard from the burning ocean. And it's not, of course, the temperature only which is changing. It's a lot of the chemistry of the water which is changing along with concentrations of CO2 in the water and acidity, etc., etc. But it is also influenced by the currents. These are massive rivers of nutrients and plankton plowing through the oceans, which are bringing food and bringing oxygen to various places. And they sort of go tangentially towards along the north of the North Sea along and bring material in there. And together, these two levels can influence organisms living in the North Sea through the growth of these organisms, the phenology of these organisms, that is the timing of life events, when they're spawning, when they're hatching, etc., but also the geographic distribution. And of course, there's different organisms which are affected differently by the same changes in the environment, and different organisms which interact with each other, which lead to quite a complex pattern, and it needs real detective work to work through all these elements here. So we were sort of interested how these plankton, which we have seen at the beginning, how they are changing over time. We have wonderful resources there. It's the continuous plankton recorder, which has been running for about 60 years, and it gives us some idea what plankton is in the sea. So on that map, which you're seeing here, every of the green points, which are usually along shipping lines, is a sample of plankton over time. And we know quite well that the plankton community has changed over time. But we are interested really here in the sand eel. And the sand eel is a key species in the North Sea ecosystem. It is the main food for a lot of the predators, and that's predatory fish, and that's sea mammals, and that's seabirds in the North Sea. If there wouldn't be the sand eel, there would be nothing there for them to eat. And it is very abundant. It's often a little bit underappreciated. By preparing for that exhibit, Mike told me, we actually have no sand eels in the exhibit in Glasgow. So now you have, and you can actually see the sand eels in the exhibit. And so we wanted to understand how the plankton changes from the point of view of the sand eel. So we only looked at plankton which we know sand eel is eating. And that's what we call a prey field. So it's specifically only all the plankton, the zooplankton, which is eaten by the sand eel. And as a fun fact about sand eels is sand eels eat cod at some stage in their life. Very early in the season, the sand eel is a bit larger than cod and can eat them. Of course, cod soon overtakes sand eels, and for the rest of the time, cod is eating sand eels. So we're only looking at plankton which is eaten by sand eels, and we are concentrating on particular areas where we know sand eels are important, and we know something about the predatory community around them. And so for the rest, well, in the talk, I'm mainly going to mention areas of the first of force, and that's the area around the seabird island of the Isle of May, on which we have a lot of information. And we'll talk also, mention a little bit what's happening around Shetland, which is also have a rich seabird community. And here we really want to look at the smaller spatial scale, rather than looking at the whole North Sea, where changes at some place might mask smaller changes at other places, and we miss the changes which might be experienced by sand eels, say, for instance, in the first of force. So when we're looking at these prey fields and how they changed over time, we find some interesting changes. But first of all, I need to introduce you a little bit into the biology of the sand eel. As the name already says, the sand eel, most of the year and most of the time, lives hidden in the sand. And only in the spring, summer, they're actually emerging from the sand, and they're coming up in the water column and forage near the surface. And they're only coming up in the morning, they're feeding during the day, and during the night, they come down again to the substrate. And so first in the year, the adults are coming out, which are called the 1+ group. They're spawning at the same time as well. So a little bit later in the season comes a second wave, the young sand eels, or the O group sand eels, which are much smaller than the 1+ group, but much more numerous as well. So we kind of have two stages of sand eels each year. So if we're looking here at the biomass which is available in these different areas, so I have here the Shetland and the first of force, and that's on the vertical axis, we have the total biomass available in the prey field of the sand eel, and that's time going somewhere from the late 1950s to present. And we see that the prey field for both the 1+ group and the O group in the Shetland has actually over time increased. They seem to have more food available now than they used to have. Whereas if you're looking at the first of force, so that's the area around the Isle of May, where we know the life of seabirds best, actually the prey field has declined over time, and much more strongly so for the O group sand eels than for the 1+ group sand eels. If we're also looking a little bit at the phenology of when most of the food is available, we see also slight trends over time. So in this figure here, the light the color, the more yellow the color is, that's where the peak food abundance is available. And you see there's a slight trend in the Shetland that over time, there's peak food abundance is tending to be a bit earlier, whereas if you're looking in the first of force, that tends to be a bit later over time. So the important thing is that the prey field of the sand eel is changing over time, but these patterns are different for different parts of the North Sea. So that has actually led us a little bit to rethink a little bit the common story as it's typically told about the sand eels in the North Sea. You might have heard that the problem for the sand eels in the North Sea is the decline of Calanus finmarchicus, and that's this big chunky guy here, and that they are declining and are being replaced by much smaller species, skinny species, which have less energy, like Calanus helgolandicus. But actually, they are mainly predominant in the north, and they actually never had been in very important numbers, say in the area of first of force. So they haven't actually declined, and the numbers further north, they are maintaining themselves. However, what happens around the first of force is that a lot of these very small copepods, and that's one example presented here, and that's to scale. So you see how much smaller they are. They have massively declined. So around the first of force, they have declined. Also, on average, the size of plankton around the first of force is now larger, but because the huge numbers of the smaller ones have declined, there's less food there in the prey field for the sand eel. So what is the impact of that on the sand eels? And it was Agnes, she was using results from experimental studies and from size measurements of wild-caught sand eels. She built a clever mathematical model of sand eel growth. So she modeled that growth, and then she tested the influence of food availability and temperature on the predicted variation in size of these sand eels for these different areas for which we knew the prey field. And so what you're seeing here on these graphs are the actual observed changes in size of sand eels over time in gray, and her model predictions in red. And maybe highlighting here the first of force here again, where you see it's actually a remarkable good fit between the predicted values and the observed values. But you also see over time, the sand eel has shrunk. They have become smaller, and that is significant in the area of the first of force. You see a similar decline in the Dogger Bank. If you're looking further north, the Faroes and Iceland, you don't actually see that decline. But you also see that the sand eels there are larger than further south. And for the Shetland, we don't have actually enough data to look at trends over time. There's only data of size of sand eels over 3 years. But you're seeing here the growth curves over the season from 3 different years, which are in different colors. And you give here a little bit of impression of the size of these sand eels up in the Shetland, which are similar to other areas further north. So they have good size of sand eels there. And the food availability, as we've seen in previous slides, had been actually high around in the Shetlands. So one of the things we're learning from that is that the sand eels have a spatial structure where the different populations along the coast of the UK differ in size. We also know they differ in productivity, and they have very limited dispersal, these sand eels. They don't really disperse further than about 200 kilometers. So there's no much mixture between these different populations, and we can really sort of recognize along the UK North Sea coast 4 different populations of sand eels, which each of them are doing their own things. So sand eel, of course, is a very important food for top predators, like seabirds or like the kittiwake. Now, if you're looking at long-term trends in breeding success of kittiwakes, we're seeing that neighboring colonies show very similar long-term trends. So all the birds, colonies around Shetland are all doing more or less the same thing, but something very different from the birds breeding on Shetland, and they, from the Orkneys in black. And they again are different from what happens in most of the Scottish east coast. And they are different again what happens further south along the English coast. So we have a spatial structure in sand eels, and overlapping that, the spatial synchrony in kittiwake breeding success, relating the 2 things with each other. Now, what are the consequences of these shrinking sand eels on say, a forager like the kittiwake? The kittiwake picks up sand eels from the surface, and they can bring home a whole stomach load of sand eels to their chicks. So they are specializing on the small sand eels on the second wave, the O group sand eels. And over the last sort of 30 years, we saw a decline in lengths of sand eels of about 20%. That 20% decline in lengths translates in about a 50% decline in energy available per fish, because energy scales to the volume and not the linear dimension of the fish. So that basically means a kittiwake parent has now to collect twice as many fish as it had to do about 30 years ago. And that's certainly going to put an energetic and also time constraint on these animals. Now, there's a very different story for guillemots, for instance. Guillemots, they are what we call so-called single prey loader. They can't fill their stomach with lots of fish and bring home. They have to carry the fish home in their beak, and they can only carry 1 fish at a time. So they have to specialize on large fish. So they are specializing on the first wave of the 1+ sand eels and other fish which are available at that time. But every extra fish they have to bring back home, that's an extra trip they have to make. So if you look at the time they have to spend foraging and thinking about the the size of the fish, the declining size of the fish, these guillemot parents have to spend more and more time spent foraging. So that's shown by these blue bars. And the red horizontal dotted line gives you the day lengths at the Isle of May during the breeding season of the kittiwake, of the guillemot. What you're seeing here is that very soon they're actually approaching the time they have actually available for foraging. They are soon going to run out of having enough time to collect the food the chicks are needing. The other knock-on effect of that, of course, is they are spending less time on their nest. The chick is exposed to the elements, and as the climate is warming, they're exposed to the heat. And the cliffs can heat up very much. There's no shade there. So they're fully exposed to the heat. And that's one of the next steps we're hoping to do, is actually looking what is the heat stress which these chicks are exposed to and is energetically expensive to them if they have to pant and actively dissipate heat. And at the exhibit is a video of the behavior of guillemot chicks when their cliffs are really warming up and all the work they have to do to keep cool. Another way how the birds can keep cool is dissipating heat through some of the uncovered surfaces, and that's where we can use thermal imaging. So what you're seeing here is a thermal imaging camera, and you see through the viewfinder, you see the guillemot in the background, and you see relatively cool colors for most of the plumage, which is insulating and doesn't let any heat through, but the warm colors in the beak where they can radiate heat, and they also can radiate heat from the legs and so on. But the beak seems to be a very important radiator of heat, and what we might see in the future that these seabirds evolving larger beaks in order to be able to dissipate more of the heat. So coming from, so to speak, changes in the copepod communities through environmental change, which travel up through the food chain, which are going to affect the growth of the sand eel. And of course, smaller sand eels are also sand eels which survive less well and are sand eels which reproduce less well. So that affects also the abundance of the sand eels. And that ultimately impacts on the top predators, which are struggling to breed successfully, which are struggling to bring in enough food during the time they have available, and struggling to look after the chicks to protect them properly from the elements, be it the heat or be it also potentially predators. So I'd like to end the talk with a quote from Sylvia Earle, an eminent marine ecologist, that all that wildlife taken out of the ocean not only affects biodiversity, it breaks the carbon cycle, the nutrient change that maintains the fabric of life on Earth. It doesn't only affect the wildlife, it is affecting also us. Thank you for listening, and happy to answer any questions if you have. Thank you very much.